Welcome to Government 148, Government and Politics of the Middle East. I want to begin by telling you about what this course is about and what it is not about. So my first point is about the focus of the course, and probably the best way to begin is to talk about what the course is not about. First of all, this course is not about the cultures of the Middle East. Undoubtedly, the culture of the Middle East is a rich and quintessentially important culture in the history of humanity. Fertile Crescent is in the Middle East, and the dawn of the civilization is oftentimes attributed to the Middle East. So by no means I'm trying to downplay the importance of the culture of the Middle East, except that in this course, which focuses on the politics of the Middle East, my interest in the culture is on what academics call politically consequential or politically relevant culture. That is, to give you an example, those aspects of the culture that, for example, tend to promote or militate against nationalistic behavior and nationalism. So, for example, in the Arab and Israeli conflict or US-Iran conflict, nationalism becomes a very important factor that has to be taken into account. Certainly, nationalism not only affects the ability of a nation to fight wars that it views to be protecting their interest, but certainly it affects their willingness to compromise with the enemy. So, in that sense, the aspect of the culture that I'm interested in is what we call the politically relevant culture. Second, I want to point out that this is not a course about Islam. Islam is the important religion of the region, and in this course, though, you will not be learning much about Islam as a faith or as a religion. After all, I'm a political scientist, and therefore my interest and focus on Islam is going to be exclusively on the political manifestation of Islam. In other words, political Islam is very important, although the religion as a faith is not a subject that I will be addressing in this course. What is interesting about Islam in the case of the Middle Eastern countries is this coincidence of the political and religious communities. Islam really has always enveloped a political community within the community of faithful, which it calls the Ummah. And in this context, probably it's appropriate for me to talk a little bit about terminology. You will see that I am not going to be using the term Islamic fundamentalism to talk about the political Islam. So this question of fundamentalism versus Islamic political resurgence is an important point for me, and in the discussion that we're going to have in this course. The word Islamic fundamentalism, or the concept Islamic fundamentalism as a metaphor, is far more descriptive of the kind of apolitical or non-political religious practices and observances that is championed by countries like Saudi Arabia and to lesser extent Pakistan, especially under General Zia, but even today, and let's say Bangladesh and other countries where they are really pushing the Islamic, or Afghanistan for that matter, under the Taliban. Fundamentalism thrives in Saudi Arabia, and it did so long before Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution made us look at political Islam. We really never took much interest in fundamentalism as it was practiced. Therefore, it would be a gross distortion to use the same label to describe something that is quintessentially different, that is political activism, that I have called and others have called Islamic resurgence movement. What scares us as Americans is not fundamentalism. At most, fundamentalism annoys us. Remember during the first Gulf War, where we were in Saudi Arabia, the media talked about the various restrictions about drinking and about dress codes that some of our soldiers who were stationed in Saudi Arabia had to observe because of the strict religious enforcement of Islamic laws. And interestingly enough, if you remember during the Gulf War, or if you've read about it, we went there to essentially save a fundamentalist regime, that of the Saudi Arabia, from a possible Iraqi invasion, or at least, if not an invasion, Iraqi hegemony after Iraq had invaded Kuwait. So rather than call it Islamic fundamentalism, because it will confuse us with the kind of practices that are seen in Saudi Arabia, the term Islamic political resurgence or resurgent Islam, or just simply political Islam, is what I'm going to be focusing on. And what scares us, so to speak, is this latter phenomena. You will hear a lot about political Islam throughout this course. So this is a topic that we're going to be looking at it and examining it, and especially when we get to not only Iran but Egypt and other countries, you will see that this is a very, very significant topic that is mobilizing quite a few of the people in the Middle East. Finally, this is not a course about history of the Middle East. There are a lot of courses that exclusively focused on the historical narratives about the Middle East. As a political scientist, my use of history is very limited. I use history, especially the recent history of the Middle East, in order to understand and analyze how the nations and in the region behave. In other words, my use of history by necessity will be selective and episodic rather than systematic and comprehensive treatment. So my point therefore is that the use of history in this course is going to be somewhat limited, and limited to the more contemporary events. And again, history is used as evidence for the purpose of political analysis. This brings me to the discussion of what the course is really about. And that shouldn't really surprise you. As the name suggests, this course is about politics. It is about governments and political behavior of the peoples in the Middle East. It is about the governmental institutions and the governmental structures, governmental processes, as well as the kind of political control that is being exercised by the rulers of these countries. And there's a bit of a comparative analysis. You will see that throughout the course I will give you a control scheme that various rulers employ to keep their people under control, and we do the comparison with various countries we study. So the control scheme is a critical part of this course, which I will be discussing. With that, I want to move on to talk a little bit about teaching and the challenges that posed by teaching this course. In that context, probably the year 2011 is very, very important. It certainly is a momentous year for the Middle East. Beginning with the year 2011, I would say teaching a Middle East politics course became much more interesting. It became much more exciting, and in many ways much more fun. Fun because if you go back, it was most of the topics in the politics of the Middle East was pretty static when you talked about the Arab world. There wasn't much change. By the same token, teaching Middle East politics after 2011, it's much more challenging enterprise than it has been over the prior 4 decades teaching this course. So during the new period, you will see that the very first month of 2011 marked a transformative political uprising in the Arab Middle East and Arab North Africa. And that uprising really heralded a dawn of a new era, and that's what makes it so challenging and so fascinating. So 2011 probably will go down as one of the most consequential years in the history of modern Middle East. If you want to look for another year of comparable significance, you would probably have to go to 1958. That year really marked the crescendo of the Arab nationalism in the region. 2011 is also important for yet another reason, because I believe it will prove to be a pivotal year for the United States involvement in the Middle East. If I'm correct, I think it would mark the beginning of the decline of the United States' role and influence in the affairs of the Greater Middle East. I use the word Greater Middle East to also include Afghanistan as part of this larger area. So it really marks the decline of United States influence after more than nearly half a century of what I would term as hegemonic presence in the area. 2011 indeed was the year of surprises and the year of shocks. The protests and uprising erupted most unexpectedly across the Middle East and North Africa. And in that context, it's worth recalling how analysts really think about things like that. It's been said, quote, "On the eve of most revolutions, they are thought to have been impossible, whereas the morning after, they are thought to have been inevitable." Virtually everyone, experts and lay, were caught completely off guard by the uprising in Tunisia, and then its contagious spread to other parts of the Middle East in the Arab world. So the spontaneous mass protest in Tunisia in very short order morphed into a revolution, ousting the dictator Zayn al-Abidin Ben Ali. From there, it spread to Egypt and became contagion throughout the Arab Middle East. And in so doing, it really ushered in some of the most revolutionary changes in the history of the Middle East. So besides Tunisia, it toppled the dictators in Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. Today, this Arab uprising is threatening dynastic rulers. And when I say dynastic rulers, in the Middle East, the dynasty doesn't really refer to monarchy. It also refers to presidents. Whether kings or president, several Arab states are feeling the threat from this Arab awakening. Most notably, the ongoing civil war in Syria, the challenge facing the rulers of Bahrain and Morocco, and therefore, you can see that this is a very tumultuous period in the history of the Middle East. So as we're talking about the Arab uprising or the so-called Arab Spring, I want to focus on what I call a misnomer. The Arab Spring truly is a misnomer because it is not a season. What it is that it marks the beginning of a long-term process, a long-term trend in which the Arab world will redefine its political space and thereby, in so doing, transform its politics. In other words, if you don't look at it just as a season, and instead look at it as a multi-year or a process that may very well take several decades, if you look at it in that context, you will note that what's happening is well beyond Islam or Islamic political resurgence. It really involves a redefinition of politics, and in that context, it may not necessarily bode well in the long term for Islamic resurgence. In other words, the fear of the prospect of Islamicist hijacking this process, I believe, is a bit premature, because even though in the early period the Islamicists may fare very well, in the long term they still have to face and deal with challenges that may well prove to be beyond their capacity. Therefore, looking at the Arab uprising in terms of a much longer process, in terms of a trend that is going to unfold over several years or decades, the better name for it is, in my view, Arab awakening, or if you like, Arab political resurgence. This certainly is one of the topics that we're going to be examining in this course, and we're going to have lots of readings about it. None of the kind of judgment we make about it are well-founded, truly, to put it truly, in its appropriate context. Some of these judgments are tentative, but you have to begin the analysis with a cautionary note that so far it looks to be heading in this direction, but we really don't know much about it and which direction it could go. It is still unfolding. Also, the year 2011 is important for other reason, because it marked for us, the Americans, the end of our involvement in Iraq war, and that also in that year, you may recall that it kind of closed one of the chapters regarding 9/11, and that was the killing of Osama bin Laden in that year. So looking to the challenges that are facing us today, one is the future of democracy in the Arab world, and particularly the area we're interested in is the largest Arab country, Egypt. The other topic that is of significant interest is the outcome of the civil war in Syria. And that conflict has a lot of ramifications, for example, for Iran and Iran's influence in the Middle East, because Iran is a close ally of Syria, for Lebanon, which has been under hegemonic influence of Syria for a long time, and only recently they have been able to assert a lot more independence. And of course, one of the elements in the government of Lebanon is Hezbollah, which is a close ally of Syria. Also for Iraq, a predominantly Shiite country, who is now beginning to worry about a replacement of the Syrian regime by a Sunni regime. Also important for Israel, because Israel has had a relatively uneventful, if not fully peaceful, relations with Syria, and the new regime that may take over, no one knows how they would behave and how important Arab nationalism is going to be for them. So, and also I should mention Turkey, which was very much now supporting, along with the Sunni fundamentalists such as Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Persian Gulf such as the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, helping the Syrian opposition. Turkey is also getting involved, and its relation with Iran has begun to suffer. So in this type of a situation, these are serious concern about the outcome of Arab awakening and how that's going to play out. The other factor of importance is Iraq itself. Since we left, Iraq's political situation is actually deteriorating. There is a lot of concern on the part of the Sunnis that they are being not well treated by the predominantly Shiite government, and the possibility of civil war from Syria working itself into Iraq is also of concern. And finally, I should add, of concern in the post-Arab awakening is the possibility of the United States and or Israel launching a preemptive war against Iran because of its nuclear activity. So perhaps we're looking at one of the most dangerous periods in the United States-Iran confrontation. Certainly Israel is mobilizing its lobby to its fullest extent to neutralize Iran and make sure that Iran will not be able to advance its nuclear program. And in this process, interestingly enough, Israel is getting support from the conservative Arabs, some of the most fundamentalist regimes like Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf. So Israel threatens the preemption in Iran, and that preemption really cannot be dismissed, although most analysts believe it makes very little sense for Israel to do so. So a war that Israel starts, everyone knows, is one that she will be unable to finish. Most likely, the United States will have to get involved into action, and if that happens, the oil prices will probably go through the roof. Shiite terrorism can be added to the Sunni ones, and in all probability, Iran will pull out of a non-proliferation treaty as North Korea did.